Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph, and in this video, we're going to be continuing our three-part discussion on best practices for advanced core strengthening. And each of these three videos is divided up into a different plane of motion that the core works in. So the previous video, we did the sagittal plane. Now we're going to move on to the coronal, also known as the frontal plane. And before we get going too much on the exercises, let's do a brief recap on what are some of the important concepts for selecting the best exercises. And the first of these principles is this: you cannot isolate any of the core muscles. You cannot isolate the rectus abdominis, you cannot isolate the parts of the obliques, you cannot isolate the deep core muscles, aka the transversus abdominis. So I know you have to take EMG studies with a grain of salt, but what we found is that any given core muscle-based movement, like a sit-up, a crunch, a side bend, rotation, etc., against resistance, gets all four of the core muscles going. All four core muscles activate together. You cannot isolate any of them. There usually, however, are one or two muscles that predominate. But it's not always intuitive which of those muscles predominate. For example, we would expect, based on the actions of the muscles, that if we do a sagittal plane motion, like a sit-up type of movement, that the rectus abdominis would predominate. And in some of them, yes, it does. But in others, like the hanging knee up, which is certainly occurring in the sagittal plane, the rectus abdominis does not predominate. It certainly activates, but it's actually the oblique muscles that predominate, and this is based off of EMG studies that I've talked about in other videos. So the bottom line is, you can't isolate any of these muscles, and there's usually one or two that predominate, but it's not always intuitive. And so we can't just say, oh, we're doing a sit-up type of movement, so this is getting rectus abdominis. Can't say that. So what we usually talk about are strengthening the various planes of motion, okay? And as long as you're hitting all of the planes of motion, you are getting adequate strengthening and activation and hypertrophy of all the various core muscles. Okay, so that's principle number one. The second principle is this, and I cover this in a lot more detail in other videos. When we talk about core stability exercises, core stability being isometric exercises of the core, like your Palloff press, any plank variation, farmer, suitcase carries, any of these isometric exercises, these core stability exercises, these for strength and hypertrophy are inferior to any of these exercises we're going to be talking about that takes the lumbar spine through a full range of motion against resistance, okay? What we know from pretty much any study is that isometric contractions are inferior to concentric and eccentric, which typically occur together. They're inferior for building pretty much any measurable parameter in skeletal muscle, whether it be size, strength, power, endurance, etc. If we want to improve those things, we need to be moving that part of the body through a full range of motion against resistance. And that's what these exercises we're going to be talking about here do. The third is a series of things, okay? And some of them we've already hit on a little bit. What constitutes a good exercise that we can select, okay? So number three, part A, if you were keeping track like that, is we want the exercise to move that area of the body, those joints, through a full range of motion, okay? Obviously, core stability exercises don't use any range of motion of the lumbar spine, so they automatically fail in this first test, okay? Full range of motion. Part B is we want to get a stretch on the target muscle at some point in the movement, okay? That means when we're moving through the range of motion, we want that muscle to be stretched as much as possible, okay? Number three, we want that exercise to be easy to progressively overload. Not all exercises are easy to progressively overload. A sit-up or a crunch, kind of difficult to progressively overload, especially through a full range of motion. And number four, we want the point of maximum stretch on the muscle, if possible, to also coincide with the position of peak tension on the muscle during that exercise, okay? And we'll actually see a few of them in this video that actually satisfy all four of those, okay? So if you can satisfy all four of these principles right here, it's probably going to be a really good exercise for strengthening and getting hypertrophy out of that muscle. Okay? And without further ado, let's get right into those exercises. Now, when it comes to core strengthening in the coronal plane, it is my opinion that realistically all you need is one exercise, and that exercise involves a Roman chair. We're going to get to that in just a minute. Now, obviously, not everyone has a Roman chair in their home, and most commercial gyms have a Roman chair, but not everybody has access to a gym. So for the individuals where the Roman chair exercise is not as applicable, I've also included a standing weighted side bend that we'll cover at the end of the video. But before we get to those great exercises, I want to cover the honorable mention first, and that is the suitcase deadlift. Now, the suitcase deadlift, which you can see right here in the video, the suitcase deadlift is a core stability exercise. It is an isometric exercise from the perspective of the core. And I know what you're thinking. You just said a few minutes ago that isometrics are inferior to dynamic resisted exercises, and that is very true. In general, dynamic resisted exercises are superior. However, if you want the isometric exercise to have an equivalent effect, you have to load it with a ton of weight. As you can see in this clip of the suitcase deadlift, I'm really not using very much weight at all. In fact, this is just a 40-pound kettlebell, and this is not remotely a challenge. I can do this all day. So, bottom line here, is this causing my core to activate? Yes. Any movement will cause the core to activate, any hinge, a squat, whatever it might be. And is the fact that I've got an asymmetry because I'm only holding the weight in one hand, is that accentuating that core contraction a little bit? Yeah. But this weight is nowhere near enough to cause the same gains that you would see doing Roman chair side bends that we'll see in a few minutes. So there's a little paradox here when it comes to isometrics versus dynamic resisted exercises. And a great example of this is the good morning exercise that we've talked about in other videos. The good morning is a hip hinge, and you're loading the barbell on your back. If you don't know what that is, go and find that on my channel. We talk a lot about it. But in a good morning, there's no concentric or eccentric motion of the lumbar spine. The paraspinals are functioning entirely isometrically, and yet it is probably one of the best exercises, if not the best, for strengthening the paraspinals. The kicker is you have to load a ton of weight. So when I do good mornings, I'm usually up in the 250 to 350 pound range. And that seems to be sufficient for anywhere in the 6 to 10 rep range for eliciting gains in the paraspinals. But if I were to do that with just 40 pounds, I'm not going to have any noticeable gains versus an exercise that moves the lumbar spine through a dynamic resisted motion. And therein lies the problem. Whether this is a personal training session, a physical therapy session, the problem is generally when this is prescribed, there's not enough resistance given to elicit any significant changes in the core's function or its strength. And so the obvious solution is load more weight. As you can see right here, now we fixed the problem. This is an easy bar with a couple of plates loaded on each side. This is the kind of struggle that we want to see with a suitcase deadlift to have any comparable change in these parameters of the muscle compared to some of these other exercises that we're about to look at. So if you're loading it with this much weight, it is a good exercise. If you're loading it pretty light, kind of like the first clip I showed you, don't even do the exercise. It's better than sitting on your butt, but there's much better choices. And that leads us to the first really good exercise that I'm going to talk about here, and that is the Roman chair side bend. Now, obviously, like I said, you need a Roman chair, but if you're really serious about getting the core strong for longevity, for athletics, whatever it might be, really invest in getting access to a Roman chair. There's a lot of uses for this piece of equipment. When you are on the Roman chair, there is a directionality to how your feet go on it, because obviously one foot goes in front of the other. So for example, if I am side bending to my right coming down, obviously when I come up, I'm side bending back to the left. The left foot would be in the front. So whatever side you're coming back up to, that's the foot that goes in the front, and it seems that that works the best on this exercise. Now, when you're doing this exercise, this checks all 4 boxes that we talked about earlier on in the video. So number one, you do use a full range of motion. We're going into, let's say, right side bending and then all the way back up into left side bending. So yes, we're going through a large range of motion here. At the bottom of the side bend, you're getting a pretty strong stretch in the lateral core muscles. A little bit in the anterior too, but mostly in the lateral core muscles. So yes, you get a stretch. And as it just so happens, because gravity points down, at the bottom position, where you're on that maximum stretch, that's also the position of peak tension on these muscles. So yes, the position of peak tension and the position of maximum stretch, they do coincide with each other, which is a big plus here. And then the final checkbox here. Yes, this exercise is easy to progressively overload. What you see right here is one form, probably the easiest form of the exercise, arms crossed over the chest. What I don't have in any clip here is the next level where both arms, or hands I should say, are behind the head. What you can even do from here is, let's say the side bend is to my right, like this. What I could do is keep my left hand behind my head and then just hold a weight here in my right arm, and that's a way I could even overload beyond that. Okay, I don't have that pictured. Then what you see right here, arms over the head. Even without any weight, it's actually quite humbling how difficult this form can be. Just by having the arms overhead, you have dramatically increased your moment arm of the spine, because now, in addition to the spine, you've got the arms as well. And then, of course, beyond that, you could hold a weight in the hands with the arms out overhead, which you can see pictured right here. So, Roman chair side bending, absolutely phenomenal exercise. It checks all those boxes that we talked about earlier in the video. And it is my opinion that if you have access to a Roman chair, this is the only core strengthening exercise that you need for strengthening in this plane of motion. But what happens if you don't have access to this? Don't have a gym that has it, or just don't have any access whatsoever, don't want to go out and buy one, don't have the space, the finances, whatever it might be. All you need is two things. You need to be able to stand up on your feet, and you need a weight to hold in one hand. And that leads us to exercise number 2. This is the standing weighted side bend. So I'm holding the weight here in my left hand, and my right hand is behind my head, okay? Now, all I'm doing is I'm letting myself side bend towards the left. Whatever hand has the weight, I'm letting my spine bend in that direction. And then as I come back up to the top, I give a very forceful exhale and use my core to bring myself up to the top. And what I also do is overshoot the top a little bit. For some reason, there's this fear around this exercise that it's bad for your spine. I have no clue where that comes from. Side bending is a normal movement of the lumbar spine, and being a normal movement, well, we should have some strength in that movement throughout a full range. So let yourself bend down as far as you can towards the side. Feel around. Explore that range of motion. If there's a portion of the range that hurts, stop just short of that. But as long as it's pain-free and it just gives a strong stretch of the obliques on the contralateral side, bend down as far as you can. Exhale forcefully, come back up to the top, overshoot the top, maybe 10 or 20 degrees. That's totally fine. That'll give you a little extra oomph to it. Fantastic exercise. You can also see that the side with the arm behind my head, I'm also a little bit on my toes on that side. If I'm flat-footed on both feet, the range that I can bend over to the left side in this case becomes a little bit restricted. If I'm on my toes, I can go a little bit further into that side bend, which gives you a greater stretch of the contralateral side. And again, that greater stretch, as we know, is super critical. And once again, this is an exercise. I won't get into the details here, but again, it checks all 4 major boxes here of what constitutes a good exercise, okay? If you don't have a Roman chair, do this exercise. If you do have one, just stick with the Roman chair. It is in all likelihood more than sufficient. So, hopefully this video gave you a good understanding of what are the best practices for strengthening the core in the coronal, aka the frontal plane of motion. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification button for notifications for all videos in the future. Keep an eye out for the next video over the transverse plane. We'll catch you there.